would you like to start, Emily?
I figured we would start along the front of the winter garden.
Sure.
It's where I usually like to start tours, and then usually kind of like to work our way in from the outside.
It's just started to snow in the Finger Lakes, and though we're not out actively gardening, it doesn't mean we have to stop enjoying the garden and the winter scenery. I joined Emily, horticulturist at the Cornell Botanic Gardens, for a tour of the Mullestein Winter Garden, which is a 1-acre area that contains over 700 plants chosen for their winter interest. So it's definitely a garden that you can enjoy year-round.
The winter garden, the idea for it started in the late 90s when one of the landscape professors from campus traveled to England and went to Cambridge University and saw the winter garden there.
Yeah.
And so he was inspired to create a similar concept here for a garden that would be of primary interest during the winter season.
Yeah, which is, I think like the blooms out of like London or whatever. I don't know if they started the idea of the winter garden, but that idea of having a garden all year long, especially when you have a cold climate like this, is it's kind of a novel idea, right?
Yeah. So especially somewhere like Ithaca, where we have these kind of notoriously long, cold, dark winters, it's really wonderful to have something that peaks this time of year that has lots of different color and winter interest. So that's the whole inspiration behind this, and it's something that people can then take inspiration from to their home gardens.
And I think, when somebody says winter interest, when you get an idea of what you're looking at, you get a sense of what winter interest is. But what is winter interest in your opinion?
Yeah, so it's a number of different things. We're looking at things like colorful branches, as well as colorful or exfoliating patterned bark. Of course, the kind of classic example is ornamental conifers, things with evergreen color, but also looking at some more kind of unusual things like all these different variations in color. Persistent fruits is another thing that you'll see in here. So things like different types of hollies.
And twisted stems,
Absolutely.
Just kind of something with an interesting silhouette, perhaps.
Yeah. So this is the Golden Curls Willow. This is a hybrid with a sort of twisted, lovely graduated color on the tips. And this is one that I tend to cut back to the ground once every year or so, as I do with all the willows in here, actually.
And are all of these willows, or any of them cornus at all?
So a number of these are cornus. The ones that you see that are shorter are all cornus. It's a combination of Cornus sericea, which is a native dogwood, as well as Cornus sanguinea, some different cultivars here. They have a slower growth rate than the willows do, so I only coppice them once every few years. And they are also a bit prone to deer browse. And this year we had a long, cold winter, so they're a little bit more stunted than they would normally be.
So the deer are coppicing them before you get to them.
Or coppicing after coppicing, that kind of new tender growth is very tasty to them, so they tend to just mow it right down.
And for people who don't know what coppicing is, define that.
Sure. So coppicing is essentially cutting something right back down to the ground, almost to the ground. You can leave, just a few inches there. And it's a way of kind of rejuvenating the plant. It works really well for these kind of multi-stemmed shrubs with a fast growth rate, and it helps them keep their color. So I recommend especially for a lot of the willows, just because they put on so much growth, I do them once a season or so, and the dogwoods once every 2 to 3 years, just to kind of help them keep that nice color.
And where we are, we had a lot of Cornus sericea and everything along those lines, and they are a favorite of deer. But the ones that did get older, that people failed to cut back, they get really woody and they lose that red or that orange or that yellow coloration.
Yes. Yeah. So it's an important part of the maintenance for ornamental value, but there's also kind of a practical history to that too. Traditionally in Europe, this dates back hundreds of years, people would keep coppices of different willows and dogwoods and then harvest them once every 1 to 2 years to use for structural materials, things like thatch roofs or making baskets, things like that, fencing. And that's something that I think is we're seeing a renaissance of that now. So there's an interesting history to them. They're really cool plants to work with.
It's neat because there's this utilitarian purpose that's reviving, but then you're also taking this other layer of bringing in beauty and recognizing it for its beauty as well, not just for utilitarian purposes.
And there's something that, in addition to being of interest in the winter landscape too, these are also wonderful to use in winter floral arrangements. So things like, you've got the Golden Curls willow here, the coral bark willow. You can put them and force them in water, or just add them to a bouquet or onto a wreath. So something that you can bring indoors as well.
Now, I'm thinking, when I think of willows, I think of something that is sometimes really hard to get rid of, and they kind of sucker all the time. And how do you maintain them or contain them?
Just aggressive pruning, really. And also, the ones The ones that you'll see along here are shrubby willows that kind of lend themselves well to this, but aggressive pruning is key. Eventually, you know, something like these curly willows, if I were to let them go, they would start to take off into like a tree. But yeah, they do grow aggressively, and they're the sort of thing that once you have, they're in there to stay, but they're very easy to propagate, so very rewarding.
And I guess as we circle around, you see these different types of birches.
Yes, so there's a couple different types of birch in here. So this is white birch, Betula papyrifera. This is a native that you'll see in the Northeast. It's not super common around here, but you'll still see it. And this beautiful white bark is a really nice color contrast against the other plants in here in the snow. And you can see over there we have, these are Acer griseum, or paperbark maple.
These are beautiful. This is one that we have on our land, Sonder. They're not as large as these. How old do you reckon these are?
Everything that was in here was planted around 2001.
Okay.
So they're not very old.
Yeah.
But you can see they've got this really beautiful exfoliating bark, this lovely sort of cinnamon red color.
Yeah.
Really fun winter interest plant that you don't tend to see too much of, but very cool, nice little specimen-sized tree.
Is that a different cultivar? Or?
Nope, these are both the same, actually.
Oh, that one has a much more exfoliating bark compared to this one, which is like less papery, I guess.
Yes, yeah. And again, another way of kind of adding texture into the landscape. Throughout here, you'll see a number of different ornamental conifers. They're hiding a little bit under the snow.
Yeah, but that's part of the beauty of it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
I think a lot of folks who are probably tuning in who come from like a warmer climate will just be like, brr, I can't even imagine like walking out in a garden. But you know, it's something that you know, provides a sort of happiness here when you're under 4 months of snow, you know?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and this is Picea Abies, or Norway spruce, which is very commonly used in the industry. This is a variety called Pendula, so it's just a weeping variety, and it's grafted onto a short trunk. So especially on a surface like this, where you've got a raised bed, you have this nice kind of cascading ground covering effect. That's really lovely. So not only differences in variety, but also what kind of a graft it's on can really, and what kind of a surface you have it on can change the effect a lot.
Now, does this get those really big cones on it as well? Or?
It does, yes. And this one in particular, well, many of the spruces, but once every 2 years they go through this cone cycle where you'll see the immature cones are this beautiful kind of fuchsia pink color. It really grabs people's attention, and that's usually around late May. So while this is a winter garden, a lot of the plants in here, especially the conifers, they do these kind of interesting things and they change throughout the season, so it's fun to watch them. They have kind of a spring as well. Seeing the new growth come out is really lovely.
Yeah.
So
we had one also that was a little bit more pendulous. It's not like, I don't know what kind of cultivar it is, but it had those really bright pink fuchsia. They stood upright cones, I guess, like as you were saying. So that comes in 1 year, and then the other cones come in the second year. Wow, that's great.
Yeah, yeah. The second year they lose that color as they mature, but yeah, very cool. And another example here, this is Cornell buds yellow. So this is a cultivar of a native dogwood, but it's really strong, kind of crayon yellow colors. Is one of my favorite varieties.
It's more like chartreuse.
Yeah. So
what was the variety again?
Buds Yellow is the name of it.
Yellow. Yeah, that's really, and it seems maybe because the deer haven't been on top of this or whatever. It's a really nice cut as well. Yeah, and I've noticed I think they're creatures of opportunity, but they don't tend to bother things in the raised beds as much. They don't browse quite as heavily. They have certain paths that they take through the garden. So, and some of these ones that weep, they remind me of Dr. Seuss, you know? Yes, absolutely. Yeah, that one on the left there is a variety of blue spruce called the Blues. It has a sort of weeping formation, but they definitely have a lot of personality about them. And again, another example of something that's on a cool, when you have something that's on a kind of a standard like that, it does almost look like a person just because of its height and everything. When we are talking about raising in raised beds, I know some conifers do better in like more well-draining material. What's the substrate that you've planted in here? Is it just kind of native soil? Did you bring something in? Did you craft something? So I wasn't here when the beds were constructed. I imagine it was a combination of just topsoil and organic matter that was put in. So I can't really say for sure. Yeah. The soil that's in here, as is true of most of this area, tends to be pretty alkaline, which is not something that most conifers like.
I do tend to go through and amend, especially around some of the more acid-loving conifers and things like holly. I'll use some granulated sulfur as well as an organic fertilizer that's kind of tailored to that. But yes, so the soil in here by nature tends to be very clayey and very alkaline, which is not what everything in here likes.
What is the other maintenance plans that you have for conifers? Because a lot of folks will tout conifers as kind of a low maintenance element that you could put into your garden beds. Is it as low maintenance as most people say?
Yes and no. They are pretty low maintenance, and they don't require, they're very rewarding because they look beautiful all winter and everything. You don't cut them back at the end of the year and that sort of thing. They do require some pruning. So typically, kind of early summer, late spring is a great time to do that, going through, and whether it's pruning just to remove like dead material or things like that, or if you're trying to achieve a certain form. So pruning, the ones that are in here don't require too much irrigation once they're fully established, so they're pretty low maintenance in that regard. And just a little bit of fertilizing just due to the soil in here, but other than that, they're not too low maintenance. They can some years kind of surprise you, especially if we have like a long warm winter that's followed by a cold snap, they might suddenly lose their foliage and get kind of, burnt, that sort of thing, winter burn. But yeah, they're very, very fun plants to work with.
I like also the color palettes because you could see that even just, you begin to appreciate, especially when you see conifers, because they're the main, I feel like they're the main thing that you look at right here in the winter garden. But you could really start to appreciate like some that have a little bit more thread-like, some that are blue colored, some that are a little more yellow-green.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's a huge color palette in here, and most people tend to think of pines and spruce when they think of conifers, but it does also include things like Chamaecyparis or juniper. Lots of different colors that can occur in species as well as different varieties. This Picea mariana here, or it's called black spruce, but to me it has a kind of a bluish color to it, is really lovely. This is one that's also native to the Northeast.
I didn't realize that this was native to the Northeast.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. And then also when you think about dwarf conifers, we added some dwarf conifers as well to our garden beds, but we're always reminded that just because it's a dwarf, it just means that it's maybe a little bit more slow growing. 30, 40 years down the road, if you're not pruning it, it might actually not be a dwarf anymore.
Absolutely, yeah. So you can have something that is called dwarf, and it may just mean that its, sort of naturally occurring species form is 100 feet, and it's 50 feet. So depending on, it's always good to look at growth rates and also just see what the kind of estimated growth size will be.
Yeah, so it's maintenance maybe over long term.
Yes.
You could plant it there and expect it to kind of fill out over the course of 10 years, but after that you might have to pull it out or replace it or snip it back.
Yeah. And another stand of the buds yellow dogwoods here. These have not been coppiced in a few years, so just to give you an idea of size.
But the color, they still hold their color.
Yes, yeah, so they're still looking, still nice and colorful. Those are due to be cut back this year.
So when you cut them back, do you cut them back in the springtime, like early spring or late winter?
I prefer to wait as long as I possibly can. I typically do it, I time it for, mid-March or so, or sometimes even later this year. I think I did them at the beginning of April. And that's just so that you can enjoy that color as long as you can. Yeah. Because once you cut them back, you lose it. And it does take a while for them to bounce back. By the end of the season, they'll fill in. But it's nice to have that. And on years when you don't do it, they play really well with things like spring bulbs. The color contrast in that is really beautiful. These are a bit covered in snow right now, but these are hellebores. So when most people think of winter interest, they think of things like conifers and shrubs, but it's also nice to have things that are sort of semi-evergreen. Yeah. So these hellebores are green pretty much throughout the winter. They start to look a little bit crusty in the spring, and I'll go through and clean them up. And then their flowers form really early in March most years. So it's fun to have things that bloom as well to kind of extend that season of interest into the spring.
Right. And I think if you go to the farmer's market or the supermarket, sometimes they'll sell, are they called Lenten roses?
Yes, yeah.
So they'll usually sell them in pinks and reds and whites, but there's so many different cultivars, right?
Absolutely,
so, yeah. These almost look way more robust. They have like tall stems. I know they're kind of tipped over, but
yes, yeah. These are they grow pretty well, and they tend to reseed really nicely in here. Most of these are from an older, I believe it's called the Ashland series. Hellebores. So
and is this like an old hydrangea?
Yes. Yep.
Which oftentimes keeps their little flower tops too.
Yes, hydrangeas are another fun one to
Yeah.
incorporate into the winter landscape as well.
There's another one that's a little
Yes.
better. They look like ice cream cone.
Yes, they do. Yeah, and those are also wonderful to incorporate into dried arrangements, wreaths, things like that.
Yeah.
So here is a really nice example of some persistent fruits in the landscape. This is winterberry holly, llex verticillata. And
Which is also a native, right?
yes, that is
Yeah.
a native. You'll see it growing along stream banks around here. Tends to favor sort of wetter areas. And unlike when most people think of holly, they think of something that's evergreen. This is a deciduous one, but they do have that really beautiful, brightly colored fruit, which is also a food source for the birds. And this is kind of a classic one that's used in winter arrangements as well. But really nice splash of color to the landscape.
I do wonder though, I'm like, do birds really eat it? Because the berries persist seemingly all season. I feel like it's famine food for the birds.
Yes, yeah, they do tend to hang on for a while compared to some of the other different ones.
Yeah.
I've noticed that as well. But
And you
yeah.
need both a male and a female to
Yes.
produce these berries, right?
Yeah, so they are dioecious. You need a male and a female, and when you purchase one at a nursery, it'll typically be labeled what the cultivar is.
Right.
But you need to have at least one male in close enough proximity to a female.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you could have multiple females and one male, and that male
Absolutely.
will be prolific.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes, and of course the males will not fruit. So
Yeah.
that's so typically people tend to have more of the female ones.
One thing I would want to ask you actually, and maybe we could use this as an example. We have a blue spruce, and it started to lose some of its, because the light wasn't getting to it.
Yes.
How would you start cutting back some of the, branches on the bottom? How would you, because this is a great example.
Yes.
You have some of these tips right here, but then you get all this kind of dead growth in the back. How would
Right.
you manage that?
Well, regular pruning is definitely something that's helpful. If you can open things up to allow more light penetration to the inside. It is something that they tend to do in nature. They do tend to senesce and lose more of their needles towards the inside and then grow more densely on the outside. And in the case of some of the ones that are in here that are so old and were already established before I came in, it's there's only so much I can do to kind of rejuvenate them.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
yes, but important. Regular pruning is important to kind of keep them.
I took the skirt up on one of our blue spruce, and Sandra was like, "Oh no, I don't like that." And I was like, "Okay, let's just plant a bunch of bushes underneath it."
Yeah, that's true. You can also hide things.
Yeah.
If there's a view of something that you don't like, you can kind of put things around it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is in the nature of what they do.
This is exquisite.
Yes. So this is a Chinese birch. This is Betula chinensis. Really kind of tightly exfoliating bark with different kind of grayish and reddish tones on it.
It reminds me of like a more muted river birch.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, it's a little more compact and
Yeah.
little less colorful, but yeah, very cool patterned exfoliation. We have a couple of river birches in here as well. And this is one of my favorite trees in the garden. So this is
It seems like it has so much lore to it.
it does. And the surprising thing is that this tree is only about 20 years old.
Oh my gosh. This is
yeah.
like the little old lady lives in this tree.
Exactly, yeah. And it has so much personality. Willows, they tend to have often these kind of gnarls and burls as they grow, and you can see where some of the scars where branches have fallen off and they form nubs.
Yeah.
And the wood tends to be very soft. Sometimes parts of it will kind of rot and fall off, but they have this remarkable ability to just keep growing and regenerating even
Right.
after breakage. And you'll sometimes see this is growing moss, but sometimes you'll see little ferns and things kind of growing in them as well. We have one in the arboretum that's a host to a number of other different plants that have found homes on it.
And what
But-
kind of willow is this?
This is Salix matsudana, and snake is the name of the cultivar. It's a Japanese corkscrew willow, but really lovely, kind of tightly spiraled branches.
Yeah.
And yeah, just a lot of personality. And just to give an idea of how aggressively willows grow, so they can fill in quite quickly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Luckily, they do lose their leaves though in the winter months, so they don't completely shade out everything.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
yes. Yeah.
And then would these be examples? Well, these still look like females.
Yes, so these still have a bit of fruit on them. They're just not quite as much as their neighbors over there, but yeah. You can see some more dogwoods over here and some arborvitae. Another fun example of a perennial that you can use in the winter landscape is this Amsonia over here. This is Amsonia hubrichtii, or bluestar, and they have these lovely kind of feathery foliage and lovely blue flowers in the summer.
Yeah.
And in the fall, they turn this brilliant yellow at first, and they continue to fade, but still this very cool kind of wispy looking foliage. And I tend to leave these eventually after enough snowstorms, when they kind of start to hang their heads, is when I'll take them back down to the ground.
So you do cut them back every year?
Yes, yeah. So, but I leave them as long as I can, since they do hold a bit of that interest into the winter as well, similar to some ornamental grasses.
Do they have a tendency to seed, or how does it spread?
I haven't
noticed. It looks
noticed
clump forming.
Yeah, these I haven't noticed much spreading on these. They tend to just kind of stay in these clumps. So
nice.
Yeah. And behind us we have these will be really lovely, typically around February. These are witch hazel.
Oh, yes, nice.
Yes.
'Cause that's when they start to flower,
yes.
surprisingly.
Yeah. And so both of these are hybrids, and so these bloom in the spring. We do also have some that are the native one, Hellebore virginiana, which blooms in the fall. But I love things that bloom at kind of unusual times of year. So like February with these, or November in the case of the native species. And this variety, Pallida, they have these really lovely kind of spidery looking yellow blossoms, which have a wonderful fragrance to them. There's another cultivar over there called Diane, which blooms kind of a rust red color.
Yeah, those are really nice because, I love the smell of them personally too.
Yes.
And this is obviously for people who, understand hey, is this witch hazel? Yes, that's where our witch hazel actually comes from
Absolutely.
medicine.
Yeah.
And they do have so many beautiful cultivars. I was looking at some and I was like, everything from like that pale white all the way to that rust red. And I'm like, oh my goodness, you kind of want to collect all of them after a while.
Yes, yeah. A lot of cool different cultivars with really lovely blossoms, and the fall color on them is nice too. Very fun plants.
Now, what's interesting is that you have some trees that are, kind of encircled by, by a fence. I'm assuming it's to protect from like deer and rabbit?
Yes, primarily deer with most of the cages that you see around the trees on here. These specifically are to prevent buck rub. So these are not in much danger of getting browsed by deer, but they will come through and kind of rub. The younger males will rub their antlers on them, and it can really gouge and damage the bark sometimes. So this is to prevent them from doing that. But deer are an ongoing concern here as well. They do browse on different shrubs and things. So we go through and we have to sometimes use repellents to treat for that, as well as cages and things like that. But they always browse a little bit. So
now here's something I didn't expect, but is this is this witch hazel too, or is this Bulgaria?
This is witch hazel, and I believe that this one is reverting to.
Wow.
It's a hybrid, but I think it's reverting to Virginiana because it should not be blooming right now.
Yeah, it's interesting because it's really early to be blooming.
Yes.
It's great though because now we could actually show the flowers.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And I have another one in here that did something similar a few years ago where it started to revert, and part of it was blooming at one time of year and part was blooming at another, and eventually now it's gone completely reverted to the native. But I think this one is acting similarly. But so this gives you an idea of these fun little spidery yellow blossoms.
It's really some of my favorite. And you do have such a subtle scent to it as well.
Yeah,
it's nice.
Absolutely.
And this is common, like here in the Northeast, like in the understory.
Yes.
It doesn't grow too much, higher than this, and that's a nice understory plant.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's kind of a shorter, something that'll maintain a lower profile.
Yeah.
So. And over here we have another fun variety of the Winterberry holly. This one's called Winter Gold. This lovely kind of peachy orange color. But another example of the native one.
What I love about a winter garden is that it makes you appreciate something so much more beyond, because when we think about when you're in tropical areas, you think of like big foliage and and beautiful big flowers and everything along those lines. But here you have to, it's like more subtle, and it's
Absolutely, yeah. It's something. It's a very subtle, kind of more different palette, and I think it's also just important. Oftentimes people are like, "Oh, things are so barren in the winter. There's nothing to look at." But there's actually a lot of interest if you look for it and if you're planning for it.
And then also just like looking and kind of, I know we're looking at the individual plants, but then looking at the layers too.
Yes.
And you have this pendulous Abies, and then you have all this color, and then even you have some of the color in the back, coming off of some of those trees, and then exfoliating bark. And so it kind of gives you a lot of interest when you start to just look at it as a big picture too.
Absolutely, yeah. It's the whole landscape. It's important to kind of plan for the differences in height and things like that.
Yeah.
And I think using cultivars too kind of gives you more of an opportunity to do that, because especially with the conifers in here, if you were to see them in nature as their straight species form, they would be these huge trees with a very strong, kind of pyramid X-current form. They definitely wouldn't fit in here. So. Right. As far as the economy of scale, if you have a small space, using dwarf cultivars is a fun way to incorporate things.
Is this more of a pine?
Yes, that's actually a cultivar of Pinus strobus, which is white pine, so it's native to this area.
Yeah.
That variety is called Diggy.
Diggy?
Yeah. Yeah, so they're really cute, and I love the way that they collect the snow and the needles.
Yeah.
And there's another one, or a different species of pine right next to it. This is kind of fun. This is Pinus banksiana, or jack pine. So this is one of the most northern occurring plants in North America. It's incredibly hardy.
Yeah.
And they have these wonderful kind of funky looking cones on them. They almost remind me of like a cashew or something like that.
Yeah.
But very cool form. And this is a weeping variety. So again, something that gives you a lovely ground covering effect, spilling out over a wall.
When is the best time to actually prune your conifers?
Typically, I would say around early June or so, late May, early June. And really the worst time to do it is in the fall. You don't want to do it too late in the fall, because if you encourage a lot of new tender growth, it can actually freeze once winter comes.
Right.
So around that time of year, it's warm enough, you're starting to see some actual growth on them. It's a good time to get in there and do it.
We had, with the snow last year, we had a lot of, especially with some of our kind of more quote-unquote dwarf or semi-dwarf conifers, the snow really laid on top of them and broke off a number of branches in pretty inopportune areas. And I was a little devastated. But as I started to cut them and, provide a little bit more airflow, they started to look really interesting in the landscape, because typically when you go, you see conifers, like you said, they have those pyramid conical shapes, like they're very traditional. If you have a kid draw one,
yes,
that's exactly
absolutely
what they draw. But it started to look like little bonsais in the landscape. It was just really exquisite. You could get really beautiful forms if you just maintain them a little bit.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, the pruning that I do in here, I mean, I definitely go through and clean things up, and I try to maintain shape and watch for things like if something is supposed to have a round form and it's throwing a leader and trying to be kind of rebellious. But really, everything that's in here, I think sometimes people get the impression that I'm going through and just really sculpting everything that's in here, but it's really the variety that makes it grow that way. So when you have a weeping variety, yes, I have to go through and prune it, but it's still going to have this kind of form.
Yeah.
Behind us, this is a weeping Serbian spruce. This is another very cool variety that also has those brightly colored pink cones once every 2 years in the spring. Another kind of fun form in the garden. And over here, this is one of my favorite varieties of blue spruce. This is Stilton cheese. And actually the highlight for it is in the early spring. There's a number of different cultivars of conifers that put out brightly contrasting new colorful growth. So this one gets this soft whitish yellow growth on the spring. So it's kind of surrounded by this cloud of kind of yellowish foliage. And that's where the name comes from, Stilton cheese.
Nice.
Yeah.
The one behind it too is like the nice purplish red. Is that also a cornice or?
Yes,
Wow.
This is Cornus sericea, which is a native one. The variety is called Alamans. But yeah, really deep, kind of purplish burgundy bark on it.
Love it. And then this is another highlight with some of the conifers, right, that really grow upright and straight and can really fit in a tight space.
Yes, yeah. And so species, and especially cultivar selection, is really important for that if you want something that will fit within a certain area. And earlier you had mentioned river birches. So there's a few of those right here.
I love the multi-stem look too.
Me too, yeah. So these are really wonderful addition to a winter landscape. They have that beautiful exfoliating bark on them, really lovely form. And yeah, there's something kind of just ethereal looking about them. And I love, sometimes on a windy winter day, you can actually hear the rustling of the exfoliating bark, which is fun.
I just planted a young one of these in our landscape. And when they're young, they have this nice golden yellow bark, which looks really striking in the landscape.
So mostly with conifers, we tend to think of them for their foliage, but these Penispongiana also have really lovely kind of camouflagey colored bark to them too. And another example of some really interesting bark.
Yeah, this is really bizarre.
Yeah. So this is Cyphnolobium japonicum, which is commonly referred to as Chinese scholar tree. And this one is a bit of a misnomer with the species name there being japonicum.
Yeah.
But because I believe it's actually native to China. But has this really lovely kind of grayish green colored lenticulate bark.
Yeah.
And you'll see that the branching on it is this kind of golden yellow color.
Wow, that's really cool. And it almost looks like the bark peeled away down here.
Yes, yeah, it starts to get that more kind of textured look to it at the base. And this is
a really cool tree.
Yeah, and this is something that's actually in the Fabaceae, the legume family. So the foliage is those kind of tight oval-shaped leaves you'll see on it.
And then is it a nitrogen fixer then as well? Do you know?
I would assume so, being in that family. I don't know to what extent, but
I bet it has really beautiful blossoms. Then does it? No,
I've never. Yeah,
really?
Yeah.
Because when I think of Fabaceae, I'm thinking like even the black locust. They get those really beautiful like pea-shaped flowers, and the bees love them and everything. So. Yeah.
This is actually another example of something that's reverted here, since we were talking about this earlier. And you can see what it was originally supposed to be over on the other side of this path. That kind of tightly curled, spiraled plant over there is called Harry Lauder's walking stick, which is a variety of Corylus avellana hazelnut. And this one was that variety at some point and then is just reverted.
Oh, this one was?
Yes. So this is now just European hazelnut. But I'm actually going to try to keep it going. I'm just going to keep cutting it back down to the ground. There's some things in here that are kind of funky, but I like to keep them as a teaching point for classes that come through to teach about some of these things. And they do, especially with this one being this size and everything, you really see the lovely catkins on them that are typical of that family in the spring. So it adds to the winter interest. Oh, we were talking about texture and also about some of the white pines in here. This is one of my favorite white pines. This is a variety called Mini Twists, which has this really lovely, it's actually like very soft to touch too. Wonderful kind of curled branches, or needles. There's a number of these contorted white pines that have this kind of spiral form to them, but has a really fun texture. And another example of how you can get a very different look out of something, if you want a white pine, which is a really wonderful native plant, but you don't have the space for one, you can include a dwarf one in your garden. And to give you, just to give an example, so there's a stand of them towering behind the Welcome Center over there. So quite a difference.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to keep this, say this started to grow like a hulking one like that, would you take off the leader, or how would you shape it if it started to really grow big and hulking?
Yeah, so if it did start to do that, taking off the leader, typically any time that you kind of take something from the top down, it's going to throw more lateral growth. Right. And vice versa. So if this was really starting to take off, and it has put on quite a bit of growth the last season or two, so it's due for a haircut, you can, remove the leader. And candle pruning is also effective for pines as well. So that's in the spring when they form these long kind of finger-shaped growths called candles. You can go through and break them off, and that'll encourage more kind of dense growth on them as well.
Right.
So
now I don't know if you could confirm this, but we heard. Oh, here's some of the catkins of the birch, by the way.
Oh yes.
Yeah, which is nice to see.
Yeah.
We ended up getting some land that was an old plant nursery, and I was told, I can't verify this, but that some of the trees from the Winter Garden actually were from that plant nursery, which I thought was kind of neat. we could like kind of, I don't know if it's true.
It's definitely possible. We've sourced a lot of our material from local nurseries.
Yeah,
so.
because the nursery specialized in dwarf conifers and kind of interesting species. And so we have a lot of that on our land, which made me appreciate them more because I was like, I don't know if I would ever actually plant this way. But then when you come here and then you see all the different varieties and the shapes and you go through 4 months of snow, you begin to really appreciate it and really want something in the garden that kind of holds its own throughout all those seasons, you know?
Yes, yeah. Yeah, it's really fun to kind of take examples, and I hear that from people all the time that they come to visit here and they take inspiration from things that they see home to their gardens.
Yeah.
So.
And then what are some of these ones with the haws or the berries on top here?
So those are, these are Crataegus viridis, which is a native hawthorn.
Yep.
And another example of something with persistent fruits. And these ones do tend to hang on for a lot longer. Nothing really persists the entire winter. Eventually, as we mentioned, the birds will get them or they'll start to fall off.
Yeah.
But really beautiful, brightly colored fruits on them. And as you can see where they get the name from with these very long, sharp thorns.
Yeah.
So you have to be careful when you're working around them.
And we have these natively growing, I don't know, is this a native variety?
This species is native,
Okay.
yep.
Yeah, we have some of these growing in the understory of our forest too. So not this tall though.
Yeah.
A good medicinal plant as
yes,
well.
that's true. Yeah,
good
they
for
have a
heart
long
health.
history of that, and wonderful, and as well as the fruits on them too. They have this beautiful kind of exfoliating pattern bark too.
The bark is
has interesting
lovely.
color. Yeah.
You tend to not notice it in the forest, but here it's really prominent.
Yeah. So we've mostly focused on more dwarf conifers so far. So I thought it'd be fun to give some examples of things that are a little bit taller,
Yeah,
just to play with
great.
Height variation. So this is Juniperus rigida, which is an Asian species of juniper. Has these kind of sharp, prickly needles on them, but really fun kind of form to this plant. This is a cultivar called Pendula, so it's weeping. And you can see they're absolutely loaded with these berries, or arils as they're called this year. I've noticed this year in general just seems to be a heavy year for conifers and things like yews and junipers as well, conifers that bear these arils. They just seem to be absolutely loaded. I don't know why that is.
Yeah,
but.
I mean, we had our hickories this year was like insane.
Yeah.
So maybe it was just a really good year for a lot of trees.
And over here, this is one of my favorite conifers. This is Abies concolor, or concolor fir. And this is something that's native more to the western U.S. And they tend to be they become more popular in recent years as a Christmas tree, actually.
Yeah.
And one of the fun things about these, actually, is their scent. So if you break off the needles and smell them, they have kind of a citrusy scent. They contain some of the same chemical compounds. To me, it's an almost kind of grapefruity kind of smell.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
Actually. But still has that scent of pine in the back.
Yeah.
It would make a really good candle scent,
Yes.
wouldn't it?
It would, yeah.
I would really love that as a candle scent. Grapefruit and pine.
Yeah.
Kind of like, well, Abies, it's not a pine, but
Yeah.
you know.
Yeah, similar family of scents. But yeah.
People might, fir, I guess, right?
Yes, fir scent, yeah. Yeah, and the color on this is really quite beautiful too. It's got this kind of silvery, blue-gray, greenish foliage.
So, I don't know if you noticed this one, but this is in our memorial garden. This is the blue one there, but I see how tall it is.
It's a bit thicker needles.
Yeah, it does. I think it's a different cultivar. It has 2 liters right now, and I'm like, I have to get a tall enough ladder to go out there and chop one off.
Yeah.
You can see like when the birds go up the top, they don't know which one to go on, you know?
Yeah.
Which one to stick.
What happens if you keep the 2 liters? Why is it wrong to have that?
Well, I think it just starts to have a different, correct me if I'm wrong, but like a growth structure that kind of goes out this way, and they're competing leaders, and then it could actually structurally hurt the plant, right? When you have 2 leaders going off in 2 directions.
Yeah, so if you have 2 of them, especially if they're very tall and heavy, they can eventually start to split down the middle. So typically one is preferable. And the reason that most conifers have that kind of strong excurrent shape to them in nature is to shed snow. So there is a evolutionary reason to that as well.
Right.
So that they don't break in the snow, which is something that does sometimes happen in here with some of these more kind of dwarf plants or some of the boxwoods as well. They can be somewhat prone to winter breakage.
Best time to prune boxwoods, tell me, because I got to start pruning mine.
I usually try to do them in late spring.
Okay.
And it's important to, so you can shear them to kind of keep the effect of whatever shape you're going for, as well as, you know, kind of getting down and kind of taking out branches to thin as well, because eventually if you keep shearing them, they'll concentrate all of their growth on the outside and lose more of the inner foliage.
I see.
So
would you be able to take them back? Would you recommend like no more than a third, or is that too much? Or
I'm not sure that I would take these back a third. They boxwoods they're pretty slow growing, so you know they will bounce back eventually, but it's going to take a while. But I would look first at the plant and see. You know, for something like this, like I can see these are sticking out really far. So you could take it to here, or you could take it back even further and kind of open things up. So I'm aiming more for form with these than I am for a particular ratio or size.
I feel like I'm asking for a friend, but no, we're asking for ourselves because we have these massive boxwoods and they've gotten so big. And I was like, I don't know how much I could actually take them down without hurting them.
Yeah.
Would they survive though? If you cut half of it back.
Half is a little aggressive, though.
Yeah, typically you don't want to do more than a third. They can tolerate pretty aggressive pruning, and there's been some here that have been cut back, not in this garden, but elsewhere that have been cut back severely that still continue to grow, but they're very slow growing, which is also one of the reasons that they're so expensive to buy at nurseries.
Yeah.
And they also have very strong wood to them. The reason that they're called boxwood is traditionally they were used for making fine carved objects like jewelry boxes or chess pieces, things like that.
I never really thought about that. Yeah.
And if you ever go to dig one out, you'll encounter the roots on them are like phenomenally tough. So
right on.
Yeah. And I'm told there is a moth, I believe, that is destroying them, that it's on its way here. So we're working on an IPM plan for that.
We actually had something that was more like looked like a weird crystal mealybug on them, but nothing that really harmed the plant too much. It just looked a little unsightly.
Yeah.
You could kind of shake it right off. I'm not quite sure what it was. It looked like calcium oxalate crystals on the outside or something.
Yeah.
But I have heard that, you know, the boxwood, and I watched some of the UK gardening shows too, and that was like a real damaging thing out there for them as well. So I don't know if it's the same species or whatnot, but yeah.
I've heard there's a number of things that have been really damaging a lot of the boxwoods over in the UK, and these ones do get boxwood leaf miner too, which you'll see in the spring, you know, or you'll see the leaves starting to curl and pucker, and if you open one up, you can actually see them kind of little worms crawling through there.
Interesting.
But timing the pruning in order to help remove those is actually a good way to kind of keep them at bay.
When you remove them, would you have to get them from where they fall as well? Like, are you trying to ideally?
So typically, when I go through and try to prune these, I also try to rake up anything that's fallen as well, just to minimize it. And they seem to be able to live with a certain number of it each year. So we try to avoid, unless it's really necessary, actually treating something. But so we're walking under some crab apples right now, which you can see some fruits on them as well. Not quite as much as on the hawthorns, but similar persistent fruit.
And beautiful bark.
Yes.
And I think a sapsucker might have liked this tree too.
Yes, I think so. It looks like something's been working on it.
Yeah.
Most of the plants that you see on this slope are ground covering junipers, of course. They're pretty rugged utilitarian plants. I know some people aren't particularly fond of them. I have a soft spot for them personally.
Some people say they smell bad.
Oh.
I don't, like, somebody says, somebody wrote on the channel, they're like, juniper smells like cat pee. And I'm like,
See, I think I tend to think of boxwood as being the one that most people associate with the kind of cat pee smell. And I'm not sure what causes that. It's probably a certain chemical compound in it. But I love the smell of junipers. It's this rich kind of evergreeny sort of gin type smell.
Yeah. I mean, I like it too. And I like how they have so many different kinds of shapes to their leaves and everything along those lines too.
Yeah, and
great for slopes, which is like what you have
absolutely,
here.
yeah. So good for erosion control, and especially if you have like kind of a dry, compacted site, they tend to perform pretty well. And there's a lot of different species in cultivars. So you can see there's kind of a mix of some different Asian species here, as well as these ones that are closest to us are actually the Juniperus virginiana, which is the native species. And these are called gray owl. I love that name for a cultivar, but they have kind of a softer appearance to them and more grayish foliage.
Now, one of the things that I haven't seen yet in the winter garden, maybe you have them here, but do you ever grow like mountain laurels or rhododendrons here?
I don't have as many of those in here. There are quite a few of them over on Comstock Knoll, which is mostly conifers as well as rhododendrons and azaleas. Yeah. But those are also a really nice addition to a winter landscape. So incorporating things like broadleaf evergreens, as well as conifers, it's a nice visual effect.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I love the fact that like my mountain laurels, like I went outside today and I was like, hey, they still have leaves on.
Yes.
And the rhododendrons as well.
Yeah. It's there's something really nice about seeing that. It almost something that you wouldn't expect to still see them hanging onto their leaves in the winter, even though they do tend to kind of shrivel, the colder that it gets. But once it gets, back up to a certain temperature, they perk up again. But it would be nice to incorporate some more of those into here. And so this is Parodia persica, or Persian ironwood. I don't think I'd ever seen this before working in this garden. But it has really interesting kind of patterned, sort of camouflagey looking bark. Yeah. And it is actually in the witch hazel family, which you can see a bit of that in the leaves.
Similar leaf. But it's holding on to its leaves pretty well.
Yes, yeah.
Almost like an oak,
Yeah, so they are pretty persistent. And I'm thinking about adding some oaks in here as well, because those are things that hang on to their leaves are another interesting addition to a winter garden as well.
Always good to have an oak.
Always good to have an oak. That's our like recurring joke here, because my last name is Oaks.
Oh,
and
that's
every
right.
time
Of course.
everyone's like, oaks are just so good to have. I'm like, I know.
Absolutely.
One of our most important trees. The hawthorn's a great example of the ones with like, it has thorns on it. Mm-hmm. But I almost feel like you could go more in that direction too, a little further off this path, like, because thorns kind of are interesting too, right?
They are too. Yeah, there is an interesting form to them. Absolutely. There's not too many things in this garden that have thorns on them, but they are kind of an interesting design feature.
I just want to point out that some of the samaras are hanging right.
Oh yes,
here, which is kind of cool.
Yeah. And this is another Acer griseum paperbark maple.
I didn't think that they would hold on to them, but that's pretty neat that they are.
Yeah, and I noticed it was a heavy year for samaras too. The ones that are that we looked at the beginning of, those all seem to shed their samaras earlier this year. And there was also like a prolific year for them. There were quite a few of them on there. And I'm working on adding a few hollies in here. They do get somewhat browsed by the deer, but these are meserve hollies, Ilex meserviae. And
these are the ones that keep the leaves through the winter?
Yep. So they have this kind of evergreen foliage to them, which is really nice, kind of waxy. This is, when most people think of a holly, they think of foliage like this. Yeah. And these as well do need to have a male as well as a female. And I actually, I neglected to get males for them, and I think that they've actually cross-pollinated with the native hollies in there. I started to see fruits on them.
Oh, interesting.
So,
okay. Yeah, because certain males only pollinate certain females, right?
Right, yeah.
And then, but hey, you might have figured something else out that you didn't know. And then talk about, I guess, more of like the landscape design. I know you weren't here for that, but Is this considered more of a formal garden because of the stone wall, or how would you describe this?
Yeah, so I would describe this as being a somewhat more formal garden. You have this very kind of strong structure of the raised beds in it, and if you ever see, we have a few aerial photographs of this garden on our website. It's interesting to see the shape of this is very geometric. So looking at this whole area from up above, there's almost like a what you think of as like a Celtic cross or a solar cross shape to it, where you have these kind of concentric circles with two lines running through them. See that someone has left us some artwork here.
Someone did the smiley face in the snow.
I always enjoy. I always love seeing things that people leave in here. Sometimes people will build snowmen. I've seen people like trace patterns into the snow. It's kind of fun to see people interact with this space.
A snow-moji?
A snow-moji?
Yeah. This is another example of the weeping Norway spruce, and this one is huge, as you can see.
It is massive.
So this is, and it's definitely in need of pruning. And you'll notice too that they tend to throw up these branches. It almost looks like, what are you going to do? And then they develop enough weight to kind of bend back over again.
Oh, so, is it? Okay, so this one looks like it might be like a weird leader, and then it just goes back down again. Fascinating. So that's probably what this one was at one point.
Yes, yeah.
That's good to know.
Yeah, it's good to keep an eye on things. Sometimes they might start to misbehave, but sometimes it is really just with a weeping thing. They're growing up and then kind of down again once they develop enough weight.
This one like this,
Oh, yeah.
I do love the weeping varieties, and when they get so big, especially when I was a kid, I feel like I could just, it's like a little cavern. You could go right under them, you know?
Yeah,
it's pretty neat.
Yeah.
Yeah, this is a beautiful structure too. What's this?
So this is Carpinus betulus, actually, and this is a columnar variety of it. So, which is funny. Oftentimes people are asking, like, "Wow, like, do you go through and prune that really, severely?" And no, it's just so that dense. Particular variety.
Yeah.
And I do towards the base. It kind of, I think you mentioned earlier, like taking up the skirt. Sometimes it'll throw kind of wayward branches that I'll go through and prune out. But that's another example of something that is a deciduous plant, but has a really interesting just form to it.
Yeah.
As well as this ginkgo over here. This is a variety called Blagan. I have no idea where that name comes from. But
it's so meaty. It looks like
it really is,
stocky and thick.
Yeah. Ginkgos they're of course a very commonly used street tree. They are very resistant to diseases, salt damage, things like that. And but they also have really interesting winter form. They've got these kind of nubby buds on them, kind of tight branching as well. And this one, it's definitely got a slant to it. It started tipping over at some point years and years ago, I guess, but still continues growing. It's not as noticeable when it has the leaves out.
That could look cool too. Like when I think of Japanese gardens and you see their pines, they're never they're always kind of growing a little bit more strangely. And
I think it's one of the things that I enjoy about the different forms of things in this garden too, because you have the kind of anchor of these strong geometric shapes, but not everything has to be, perfectly shaped. It can be kind of whimsical and unusual looking and things to kind of soften the edges of these lines.
This is a great example of something that's a little lighter colored.
Right. Yeah.
Is this another white pine?
It is, yeah. Lighter kind of colored foliage as well, and probably a little bit of chlorosis going on as well, I think.
Well, we've seen so many different types of these strange cultivars of Pinus strobus, the white pines. Mm-hmm. What do you think makes some of these trees throw off so many different kinds of weird sports?
Yeah, it's hard to say, but there are a lot of particularly white pines as well as Norway spruce. There's just a lot of different cultivars to them. And, so oftentimes the way that this will happen, somebody might find something as a kind of a chance seedling out in nature, or what's called a witch's broom. So they'll throw off a random kind of mutated branch and people will collect them and propagate them.
Yeah.
And I think part of it might just be too that, these things are so widely grown that it's easier to find examples of.
Right.
Norway spruce, of course, is not native here, but it's one of the most commonly used ornamental conifers. So there's probably more opportunity to find things like that. Yeah, and I wasn't really much of a winter person before I started working in this particular garden, and it's really kind of changed my outlook on things, I think, working in here. Just being able to really enjoy all these different colors and forms in winter, and it's really kind of given me more of an appreciation for conifers as well.
I think that's really important because we could get very stuck in our ways.
Yes.
And like when we moved onto our land, I felt the same way because I was more of a native plant person. And you know, you could kind of get like, and I understand that native plants, absolutely love them and whatnot. And there's a lot of native varieties here, it's just cultivars. But the fact that the gentleman had planted so many different types of interesting conifers, you know, Japanese maples, he really won me over in a way because it made me appreciate, and when you get involved in like plants and horticulture and botany, it's like there's just so many beautiful things you just want to go out there and experiment. And the fact that, like we were talking about, the fact that you do go through 4 months of sometimes dreary winter and then you could actually come and have a snow emoji here and make it smile.
Yeah.
It's just a really wonderful thing. Well, thank you. I think this is just such a lovely tour, and I hope if people get a chance to come out this way that they'll spend some energy and come out to Cornell and actually see the Winter Garden.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks.
In addition to the Mullestein Winter Garden, be sure to check out the F.R. Newman Arboretum, which is a 100-acre arboretum right on Cornell's campus. The Arboretum is closed to vehicles during the winter months, but it's still open to visitors by foot. And if you want more ideas of good hikes and experiences in the area, then be sure to check out our partners over at visitithaca.com. See you in the next video.